The ones the world calls worthless are often the first to hear a cry that everyone else chooses to ignore. The wind swept through the towering pines of Ashen Ridge, carrying the scent of rain and distant cedar as twilight settled over the northern territories. Lanterns glowed across the village square where laughter, music, and celebration welcomed another moon gathering, but Evelyn Carter stood alone beyond the last ring of light, her pale hands folded tightly around the worn edges of her gray cloak. At 22, she had long accepted that no one expected anything remarkable from an Omega like her. The whispers followed her everywhere, soft enough to deny, yet loud enough to wound. Too quiet, too weak, too ordinary. Even the children had learned to look past her as though she belonged to the forest more than the pack itself. Earlier that evening, while others danced beneath strings of silver lanterns, Evelyn had spent hours tending an injured songbird hidden inside the old healer's cottage. By the time she returned, the celebration had nearly ended, and no one noticed she had been gone. Perhaps they never would have noticed if she had disappeared entirely. She lowered her eyes and slipped away before another pitying smile could find her. The forest welcomed her with familiar silence. Damp earth softened each careful step, and cool air brushed against her cheeks as moonlight filtered through the branches above. Here, among ancient trees older than any Alpha's throne, she could finally breathe without feeling the weight of judgment pressing against her shoulders. She had always believed the woods listened better than people ever did. A distant owl called into the darkness. Somewhere nearby, water trickled over smooth stones. Evelyn closed her eyes for only a moment, letting the peaceful sounds quiet the ache she never admitted existed. Then something else reached her ears. It was so faint, she almost mistook it for the wind. A tiny cry. Fragile. Desperate. Alone. Her eyes opened instantly. She stood perfectly still, listening. There it was again. Not a bird. Not a fox. Something smaller. Something frightened. Every instinct inside her urged caution. Wolves avoided this part of the forest after sunset. Strange things wandered beneath the old trees, or so the elders claimed. Yet the frightened sound came once more, weaker than before, and Evelyn's heart tightened in a way she could not explain. Without thinking about the danger, she stepped away from the trail and pushed through thick ferns, ducking beneath low branches that caught at her cloak. Twigs snapped beneath her boots as the cries became clearer. They were uneven now, interrupted by tiny breaths that sounded exhausted. She finally reached a narrow clearing where pale moonlight spilled across the forest floor like silver silk. At first she saw nothing except fallen leaves and tangled roots. Then she noticed the smallest movement beneath an overturned cedar log. Curled against the damp ground was a tiny wolf pup no larger than a house cat, its snowy white fur streaked with dirt and scattered pine needles. One bright blue eye blinked weakly toward her while the other remained half closed. Its little body trembled against the cold night air, and despite every reason to back away, despite every warning she had ever heard about touching unknown creatures beyond packlands, Evelyn slowly knelt until she was only a few feet away. The frightened pup tried to stand, managed only a single unsteady step, and collapsed into the leaves with one soft cry that echoed through the silent forest. Evelyn's breath caught. She whispered, almost afraid the night itself might hear. "It's okay. You're not alone anymore." High above the clearing, hidden behind layers of shadow and ancient branches, a tall figure dressed in black remained perfectly still. Silver eyes followed every movement below without making a sound. Evelyn remained perfectly still, allowing the tiny wolf pup to decide whether she was a friend or another danger hiding in the night. Its frightened blue eye searched her face with surprising intelligence, as though it had already learned that not every pair of hands offered comfort. She slowly removed her worn wool cloak and spread it across the damp leaves before reaching forward inch by careful inch. The little creature flinched when her fingertips brushed its soft white fur, but instead of pulling away, it released a weak sigh that sounded more exhausted than afraid. Its body was cold beneath the thick coat, and every tiny breath rose in uneven rhythm against the chilly mountain air. Evelyn gently wrapped the pup inside the cloak, cradling it close enough to share her warmth without frightening it. "You have been alone for a long time, have you not?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than the rustling branches overhead. The pup blinked slowly before resting its head against her arm as though it had finally found a place where it could stop pretending to be brave. A small smile touched Evelyn's lips. She had cared for wounded birds, abandoned rabbits, and frightened deer since childhood, but there was something different about this little wolf. It carried itself with quiet dignity despite its tiny size, and even now, while exhausted and trembling, it never whimpered for pity. She carefully examined its paws and found one swollen from a long journey over rough ground. Tiny burrs clung to its snowy fur, and dried mud covered its legs as if it had wandered for miles without rest. "No wonder you are tired," she murmured while gently removing the thorns one by one. The pup watched every movement, never once showing fear. Instead, it nudged her hand with its small nose before closing its eye again. Evelyn felt an unexpected ache settle inside her heart. No living creature should have faced the wilderness alone at such a young age. She reached into the satchel hanging from her shoulder and pulled out the last piece of fresh bread she had saved for her walk home. Breaking off tiny pieces, she offered them in her open palm. The pup sniffed cautiously before nibbling the food with careful little bites, pausing every few moments as though remembering hunger could disappear just as quickly as it arrived. Evelyn laughed softly, the gentle sound disappearing into the trees. "Slow down. There is enough." Above the clearing, hidden among the towering pines, the silent observer never looked away. Alpha King Rowan Blackwood had tracked impossible trails across rivers, cliffs, and forgotten valleys for 3 endless days, but nothing he had witnessed prepared him for the sight unfolding beneath the moonlight. Every report from his royal guard had warned him to expect thieves, rogue hunters, or ambitious rivals. No one had spoken of a quiet Omega kneeling in the forest, sharing her only meal with the missing wolf pup everyone else had failed to find. Rowan studied the young woman with growing disbelief. She did not know what she held in her arms. She did not know the tiny wolf belonged to the royal bloodline. She did not know dozens of scouts had searched these woods without success. Yet she asked for nothing. She expected no reward. She simply cared because kindness came as naturally to her as breathing. A cool breeze drifted through the clearing, carrying scents across the forest floor. The little pup suddenly lifted its head, ears twitching toward the darkness beyond the trees. For one brief moment, its gaze met the hidden king's silver eyes. Rowan felt relief wash through him, but before he could reveal himself, the pup quietly turned away from him and pressed itself closer against Evelyn's chest, choosing the warmth of the stranger who had rescued it over the father who had been searching without sleep. Rowan remained frozen beneath the shadows, and for the first time in many years, the strongest alpha in the Northern Territories questioned whether courage was measured by power at all, or by the gentle heart of an Omega everyone else had forgotten. The little wolf pup drifted into a peaceful sleep, its tiny heartbeat steady against Evelyn's chest as she rose carefully from the forest floor. She adjusted the cloak around its small body, making certain not even the cool night breeze could reach it. "We need to find you somewhere warm," she whispered, glancing toward the narrow trail leading back to the edge of the village. Her cottage was small, weathered by countless winters, but it held a fireplace, clean blankets, and enough herbs to ease pain and restore strength. It would be more than this frightened little traveler had tonight. She had taken only a few quiet steps before another sound interrupted the peaceful silence. Voices, several of them. They drifted through the trees from somewhere ahead, growing louder with every passing second. Lantern light flickered between the trunks, casting long golden shadows across the forest floor. Evelyn immediately stepped behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak, holding the sleeping pup closer without waking it. Four pack patrol members emerged onto the trail, their expressions tense as they swept the woods with raised lanterns. "The tracks came this way," one of them said while studying the muddy ground. Another shook his head. The Royal Guard questioned every patrol before sunrise. "Whatever escaped into these woods is important enough to bring soldiers from the capital." A third hunter frowned toward the darkness surrounding them. "They said it looks like a white wolf pup. If anyone finds it, they are supposed to report immediately. No one is to touch it." The youngest patrol member laughed uneasily. "Or perhaps we should stay as far away from it as possible. Strange things never arrive alone." They continued down the trail, their voices fading until only the wind remained. Evelyn looked down at the tiny wolf nestled inside her cloak. The pup had not moved. Its peaceful expression somehow made the warnings she had just heard feel even more unsettling. Why would the royal guard search for one lonely little wolf? Why would trained patrols sound more nervous than determined? None of it made sense. She gently stroked the pup behind one soft ear. "Whatever frightened you before tonight," she whispered, "you will not face it alone anymore." High above, Rowan Blackwood followed every word. Hidden among dense branches, the Alpha King listened as his own search order traveled from one patrol to another, twisted by rumor and uncertainty. He had instructed every guard to recover the missing heir safely and quietly, hoping to avoid panic throughout the Northern Territories. Instead, fear had spread faster than truth ever could. His silver eyes rested on Evelyn once again. Most people would have surrendered the pup the moment they heard the royal guard was searching. Others might have sought a reward or the favor of the crown. Yet Evelyn's first instinct had not been to protect herself. It had been to protect the tiny creature sleeping peacefully against her heart. Rowan found himself silently following as she left the clearing and began the careful walk toward the edge of Ashen Ridge. The moon climbed higher above the endless forest, bathing everything in pale silver light. The little wolf stirred only once, lifting its head long enough to look toward the hidden king in the distance. Rowan expected the familiar rush of recognition that always existed between father and son. Instead, the pup gave one contented sigh before nestling even deeper into Evelyn's embrace, completely trusting the woman who had offered nothing except warmth, patience, and kindness. The sight left Rowan strangely humbled. Power had built kingdoms. Strength had won battles. Authority had earned obedience. Yet none of those had earned the quiet trust now resting so naturally in the arms of a forgotten Omega. As Evelyn disappeared along the winding forest path, Rowan made a decision that surprised even himself. He lowered the hood covering his face, stepped silently from one shadow to the next, and followed at a respectful distance. Tonight, he would not reveal who he was. He wanted to understand the extraordinary woman who had chosen compassion when the entire world had taught her to expect none in return. The narrow trail finally opened onto a modest clearing where a weathered stone cottage rested beneath towering maple trees. Ivy climbed the walls, wild lavender swayed beside the front steps, and warm light flickered softly through a single window. It was not the grand home of an alpha or the elegant estate of a respected family. It was quiet, simple, and almost hidden from the rest of the village, just as Evelyn preferred. She nudged the wooden door open with her shoulder, carrying the sleeping pup inside before gently placing it upon a folded blanket near the fireplace. A small fire still glowed beneath a bed of glowing embers, filling the room with gentle warmth and the comforting scent of cedar. The pup slowly opened its bright blue eye and blinked around the unfamiliar room before settling again as Evelyn added another log to the fire. "There," she said with a faint smile. "That is much better." She crossed the room and gathered dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Chamomile, mountain sage, and willow leaves had been collected during the spring and carefully preserved for moments exactly like this. Crushing them together inside a small wooden bowl, she mixed the fragrant blend with warm water before soaking a clean cloth. Every movement remained slow and patient, so the frightened little creature would never mistake kindness for force. The pup watched her quietly as she gently cleaned the dirt from its tiny paws. It never growled. It never tried to pull away. Instead, it tilted its head with curious eyes that seemed far wiser than any ordinary young wolf should possess. Evelyn laughed softly. "You are either very brave or very trusting." The tiny wolf responded by placing one little paw against her wrist. The simple gesture warmed her heart more than the fire ever could. Outside, unseen beyond the cottage windows, Rowan Blackwood stood beneath the shadow of an old maple tree. The strongest ruler in the Northern Territories had faced rival kings without fear, yet tonight he hesitated before the humble home of an Omega no one seemed to notice. Through the softly glowing window, he watched Evelyn carefully wrap fresh cloth around the pup's sore paw before offering a shallow bowl of clean water. She never rushed. She never complained about the late hour or the inconvenience. She simply cared for another life as though nothing else in the world deserved greater attention. Rowan's thoughts drifted to the royal palace where servants, guards, and advisors waited anxiously for news of the missing heir. His son had been surrounded by every comfort imaginable since birth, yet in this tiny cottage the young prince looked more peaceful than Rowan had seen him in many months. The realization settled heavily upon the king's heart. Meanwhile, miles away inside the royal encampment, Captain Elias Hawthorne stood over a map spread across a long wooden table. Royal guards surrounded him, each reporting another unsuccessful search. The Eastern Patrol found fresh tracks leading toward Ashen Ridge, one guard explained. But the trail disappeared near the Old Healer's Woods. Elias frowned thoughtfully. Then we search again at first light. No shortcuts. No panic. The prince must be found safely. Back inside the cottage, Evelyn finished tending the tiny paw and reached for an old knitted blanket that had belonged to her late grandmother. She folded it carefully around the pup until only its curious little face peeked out. "Everyone deserves to feel safe at least once," she whispered. The pup answered with a sleepy sigh before closing its eye again. As silence settled over the room, something unusual happened. The fireplace suddenly brightened without anyone adding another log. A soft golden glow shimmered across the tiny wolf's white fur before fading almost as quickly as it had appeared. Evelyn looked around in surprise, wondering whether exhaustion had simply played tricks on her eyes. Outside the window, Rowan saw the same gentle light, and for the first time since beginning his search, uncertainty replaced confidence. He had witnessed ancient magic only a handful of times during his life, and never had it appeared without reason. Whatever destiny had quietly begun inside this little cottage, Rowan knew with absolute certainty that it was far greater than the search for a lost prince. Morning arrived quietly, painting soft ribbons of golden light across the cottage floor as birds welcomed the new day outside the windows. Evelyn stirred the small pot hanging above the fireplace, filling the room with the comforting aroma of warm vegetable broth mixed with fresh rosemary. The tiny wolf pup stretched beneath the knitted blanket before lifting its head, its bright blue eye following every movement she made. It looked stronger than it had the night before. The trembling had almost disappeared, and a faint spark of playful curiosity had replaced the deep exhaustion she first discovered in the forest. Evelyn smiled with genuine relief. "That is a much better look on you." She poured a little broth into a shallow wooden bowl, allowing it to cool before setting it carefully beside the blanket. The pup sniffed the air, then cautiously took a few small laps. Watching it regain its strength filled Evelyn with a quiet happiness she had not felt in years. Caring for another living soul always reminded her that kindness never depended on recognition. It simply existed because someone chose to offer it. Outside, the peaceful morning was interrupted by the distant sound of horses approaching the village. Rowan Blackwood turned toward the road from his place beneath the towering maple tree. Royal banners appeared between the hills as Captain Elias Hawthorne led another search patrol into Ashen Ridge. Rowan recognized the disciplined formation immediately. They had covered nearly every mile of the Northern Territories, refusing to abandon hope despite 3 days without success. The king knew one command from him would end the search instantly. Yet something inside him resisted revealing the truth. Not because he doubted his guards, but because he wanted to understand why fate had chosen this forgotten Omega to cross paths with his son. Inside the cottage, the little pup suddenly stopped eating. Its ears lifted toward the window, listening carefully to sounds Evelyn could barely hear. A faint whimper escaped its throat before it hurried across the floor on still healing paws and tucked itself behind Evelyn's chair. She looked toward the window with growing concern. "What is it?" she asked gently. "Did you hear something?" The pup remained hidden, peeking around the chair with cautious eyes. Evelyn stepped outside onto the small porch and shaded her eyes against the morning sun. In the distance, several riders moved along the main road speaking with villagers. Even from where she stood, she could hear fragments of anxious conversation carried by the breeze. "Still searching," someone said. "The Royal Guard has doubled the reward for information," another voice answered. Evelyn frowned thoughtfully. She had never cared much for gossip, but the urgency in those voices felt different. Returning inside, she noticed the little wolf watching her closely, almost as though it feared she might leave. She knelt beside it and gently stroked the snowy fur between its ears. "No one is taking you anywhere today," she promised softly. "You need another day to recover before we decide what comes next." The pup relaxed immediately, resting its tiny head against her hand. Hidden beyond the cottage garden, Rowan witnessed the exchange with quiet amazement. His son, who often challenged experienced royal caretakers with stubborn independence, responded to Evelyn's gentle reassurance with complete trust. It was as though the frightened uncertainty of the past 3 days disappeared whenever she spoke. Rowan had spent years believing leadership meant protecting everyone through strength alone. Yet standing beneath the morning sky, watching a forgotten Omega calm the future heir with nothing more than patience and compassion, he began to question whether the greatest form of protection had always been gentleness. Before he could reflect any further, Captain Elias rode into view at the end of the narrow lane. His sharp eyes paused on the isolated cottage, then on the faint set of tiny paw prints leading toward the front steps. Rowan's expression became perfectly still. The search that had remained distant until now had finally arrived at Evelyn's door. Captain Elias Hawthorne guided his horse to a graceful stop a few yards from the cottage gate, raising one gloved hand to signal the royal guards behind him to remain where they were. He studied the small home with calm, observant eyes. Fresh footprints led to the porch beside a second trail of tiny paw prints that had not yet been washed away by the morning dew. Nothing about the cottage suggested danger. Wildflowers bloomed beside the fence, herbs dried beneath the eaves, and thin ribbons of smoke drifted peacefully from the stone chimney. Still, years of experience had taught him that the smallest clues often carried the greatest importance. Evelyn noticed the riders through the window and quietly stepped outside, closing the cottage door behind her before the little wolf pup could wander into view. She folded her hands politely and offered a respectful nod. "Good morning." Captain Elias returned the greeting with equal courtesy. "Forgive the interruption. We are searching for a young white wolf that disappeared several days ago. Have you happened to see anything unusual near the forest?" Evelyn hesitated for only a heartbeat. She remembered the frightened little creature sleeping safely inside, its tiny body finally beginning to recover after a long and lonely journey. Looking into the captain's steady eyes, she sensed no cruelty, only concern. Yet the fear she had seen in the pup whenever distant voices approached made her answer carefully. "I found signs that small animals have passed through the woods," she replied honestly, "but nothing that seemed dangerous." Elias watched her expression without accusation. She did not appear dishonest. If anything, she looked like someone protecting a frightened life that trusted her completely. Before he could ask another question, a soft sound drifted through the open window behind Evelyn. It lasted only a moment, barely louder than a sleepy sigh, but both of them heard it. Evelyn instinctively glanced over her shoulder. Elias noticed the movement. So did Rowan Blackwood from the shadows beyond the garden. Silence settled over the yard. Finally, Elias smiled gently. "Whatever is inside your home, Miss Carter, I hope it is recovering well." Surprise flickered across Evelyn's face. She had not expected kindness from a Royal Guard captain. Elias continued in the same calm voice. "Sometimes those who are frightened need a little time before they are ready to trust the world again." He lowered his gaze toward the tiny paw prints near the porch, then looked back at Evelyn with quiet understanding. "If you discover anything that truly requires our help, you may send word to the royal encampment at any hour." Without another question, he tipped his head respectfully and guided his horse back toward the waiting patrol. The royal guards followed, disappearing slowly down the lane until only the sound of distant hoofbeats remained. Evelyn released a quiet breath she had not realized she had been holding. Inside the cottage, the little wolf pup trotted toward the door as soon as she entered, pressing against her legs as though confirming she had returned safely. She knelt immediately, smiling as she lifted the tiny bundle of snowy fur into her arms. "It is all right," she whispered. "They are gone." The pup rested its head beneath her chin with complete confidence. Outside the garden fence, Rowan remained motionless beneath the maple tree. Captain Elias had recognized the signs. Rowan knew his most trusted commander well enough to understand exactly what had happened. Elias had chosen compassion over certainty, allowing the frightened heir to remain where he felt safest. Rowan looked once more through the cottage window as sunlight illuminated Evelyn's gentle smile. The ancient bond that united every alpha with those under his protection stirred quietly within him, yet another feeling had begun to grow beside it. It was not born from destiny or royal duty. It came from witnessing quiet goodness that asked for nothing in return. And deep within the little cottage, unnoticed by everyone except the hidden king, a faint ribbon of golden light shimmered briefly between the tiny wolf pup and Evelyn's hand before disappearing like the first promise of a miracle still waiting for its proper moment. The afternoon sun drifted lower across the valley, bathing the cottage garden in warm amber light as Evelyn carried a basket toward the small patch of herbs growing beside the fence. The little wolf pup followed closely behind her with steady steps, no longer stumbling as it had the night before. Every few moments it paused to investigate a butterfly or a drifting leaf before hurrying back to her side, determined never to let too much distance separate them. Evelyn could not help smiling. "You are feeling much better today," she said softly. "I think you have decided this is your home for now." The pup answered with a cheerful little bark before sitting proudly beside her boots. As Evelyn clipped fresh mint and lavender for the evening tea, she noticed something unusual. Tiny wild birds that normally scattered whenever wolves appeared now landed comfortably on the nearby fence. A curious squirrel climbed halfway down an oak tree without showing the slightest fear. Even a pair of timid rabbits ventured into the edge of the garden, nibbling peacefully on clover beneath the afternoon breeze. Evelyn looked around with quiet amazement. "They trust you," she whispered to the little wolf. "Or perhaps they simply know your heart." The pup tilted its head, watching the animals with gentle curiosity instead of chasing them away. Hidden beyond the tree line, Rowan Blackwood observed the remarkable scene in thoughtful silence. The creatures of the forest had always possessed instincts older than any kingdom. They recognized true intentions long before words could reveal them. Watching birds gather around the young prince without fear confirmed something Rowan had begun to suspect. The frightened loneliness that had clouded the pup's spirit was fading because of Evelyn's unwavering kindness. Suddenly, a soft breeze swept across the garden, carrying the familiar scent of pine mixed with wildflowers. The little wolf froze. Its ears lifted sharply, and its bright blue eyes searched the surrounding woods. Rowan felt the same ancient awareness stir deep within him. Someone else was approaching. Moments later, an elderly woman appeared at the end of the narrow lane carrying a woven basket filled with fresh bread. It was Martha, the village baker, one of the few people who had always greeted Evelyn with genuine warmth. "I thought you might appreciate some fresh loaves," Martha called with a gentle smile. "You missed the market this morning." Evelyn welcomed her kindly, accepting the basket with grateful hands. As Martha stepped closer, she noticed the tiny white wolf sitting quietly beside the garden fence. Instead of reacting with alarm, she smiled with soft surprise. "Well now," she said, "who is this handsome little visitor?" The pup watched her calmly before walking back to Evelyn and sitting against her ankle. Martha chuckled. "I believe you have already been chosen." Evelyn laughed lightly. "I found him alone in the forest. I could not leave him there." Martha nodded without hesitation. "That sounds exactly like something you would do." Her expression grew thoughtful as she looked at the pup more closely. "You know, when I was a little girl, my grandmother used to tell stories about rare white wolves. She always said they carried hope wherever they were welcomed with a pure heart." Evelyn smiled politely, treating the tale as nothing more than an old village legend. Rowan, however, felt his heartbeat slow. The ancient stories had not been invented. They had simply faded into memory over generations. As Martha prepared to leave, she gently touched Evelyn's arm. "Do not let anyone convince you that kindness is weakness, my dear. The strongest souls are often the quietest." After she disappeared down the lane, silence returned to the little cottage once more. The pup looked up at Evelyn with peaceful eyes before resting its head against her leg. At that exact moment, the air shimmered with a faint golden glow that spread gently around them like warm sunlight reflected on still water. This time the light lingered long enough for Rowan to see delicate ancient symbols briefly appear within its radiance before vanishing into the afternoon breeze. The hidden king drew a slow breath, his silver eyes filled not with fear, but with certainty. Fate had already begun writing a story that no throne, no prophecy, and no king would ever be able to change. As evening settled over Ashen Ridge, The sky transformed into deep shades of violet and gold, while gentle breezes carried the scent of pine through the quiet valley. Evelyn lit a small lantern outside her cottage and placed it beside the front steps, a habit she had learned from her grandmother, who always believed that every light left burning after sunset reminded lost travelers that hope still existed somewhere in the darkness. The little white wolf pup sat beside the lantern, watching tiny fireflies drift through the garden with wide, curious eyes. Every glowing light seemed to fascinate it, and every few moments it reached out with one tiny paw, only to watch the little sparks dance beyond its reach. Evelyn laughed softly. "You are beginning to enjoy the world again." The pup looked back at her and wagged its fluffy tail before trotting happily in a small circle around her feet. She bent down and gently brushed a few leaves from its snowy fur. "Tomorrow we will decide what comes next," she whispered. "If someone is truly searching for you because they love you, I will help you find your way home." Although she smiled as she spoke, a quiet ache settled inside her heart. She had known the little wolf for only a short time, yet the thought of saying goodbye already felt strangely difficult. Hidden beyond the garden fence, Rowan Blackwood heard every word. His gaze remained fixed upon Evelyn as she looked at the young prince with nothing but sincere concern for his future. She had never once spoken about keeping him for herself. She had never imagined rewards, recognition, or gratitude. Her only wish was that the little creature would be safe, even if that meant losing him forever. Rowan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. Few people within the kingdom had ever demonstrated such selfless kindness without expecting something in return. Suddenly, the little wolf lifted its head toward the forest. Its playful expression disappeared, replaced by quiet attention. A familiar scent had reached the evening breeze. Rowan understood immediately. The prince had recognized his father. Slowly, the Alpha King stepped from the shadows for the first time since arriving at Ashen Ridge. The fading sunlight reflected across his dark coat embroidered with silver thread, and his calm presence carried the unmistakable dignity of someone born to command without raising his voice. Evelyn turned at the sound of gentle footsteps and instinctively stepped in front of the little wolf. She did not recognize the man before her, yet something about his quiet confidence made the entire forest seem to pause. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Then the tiny wolf pup peeked around Evelyn's leg, its bright blue eye widening with unmistakable recognition. It took one careful step forward, then another, before stopping halfway between them. Rowan slowly lowered himself onto one knee, his expression softer than anyone in his kingdom had ever witnessed. "There you are, little one," he said quietly. There was no command in his voice, only relief that had been held back for far too long. The pup looked from Rowan to Evelyn and then back again. Instead of running immediately toward the waiting man, it turned around and gently pressed against Evelyn's leg one last time, seeking her reassuring touch. Evelyn rested her hand upon its head with a tender smile. "It is all right," she whispered. "I think you know him." Only then did the little wolf trot across the garden and nuzzle Rowan's outstretched hand. The Alpha King closed his eyes briefly, grateful beyond words. When he looked up again, his silver eyes met Evelyn's with quiet respect. "My name is Rowan Blackwood," he said, "and because of your compassion, you have returned more than a lost wolf to this world." Evelyn's eyes widened as the name settled into her thoughts. Before she could respond, movement echoed behind Rowan. Captain Elias Hawthorne and several royal guards emerged from the forest path, stopping the instant they saw their king. Every guard immediately bowed in perfect silence, confirming a truth that transformed the peaceful evening forever. The stranger standing in her garden was not simply a traveler. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. For a long moment, the evening remained perfectly still. The royal guard stayed respectfully bowed, while Captain Elias Hawthorne lowered his head, allowing silence to honor the moment that words could not yet explain. Evelyn looked from the kneeling guards to Rowan Blackwood, struggling to reconcile the humble stranger who had quietly watched over the forest with the Alpha King, whose name was spoken with reverence throughout the Northern Territories. Before she could gather her thoughts, the little white wolf pup happily trotted back to her, gently nudging her hand before returning to Rowan again, as though inviting them to stand together rather than apart. Rowan smiled, a rare expression that softened the quiet strength carried in his silver eyes. He reached down and gently rested one hand upon the young prince's snowy fur. "His name is Lucian," Rowan said. "He is my son, and the future of our kingdom." Evelyn looked at the cheerful little wolf with renewed wonder. Nothing about the playful pup beside her suggested royalty. He was simply a frightened child who had needed warmth, safety, and someone willing to care without asking questions. Rowan slowly turned toward her, his expression filled with sincere gratitude. "Many searched for him," he said quietly. "Many possessed greater strength, greater authority, and greater resources. Yet it was your compassion that reached him first." Evelyn lowered her eyes with gentle humility. "I only did what I hoped someone would do for anyone who was alone." Those simple words settled over everyone present. Even the royal guards exchanged thoughtful glances, recognizing that the quiet Omega standing before them had spoken with more wisdom than many nobles inside the royal court. Lucian suddenly ran back to Evelyn, pressing his tiny head against her hand one last time before looking up at Rowan with bright, hopeful eyes. The Alpha King understood immediately. Smiling warmly, he nodded. "You may thank her." The little wolf stood on his tiny hind legs just long enough to gently touch Evelyn's arm with one soft paw before letting out the sweetest little sound she had ever heard. Her eyes filled with quiet emotion as she knelt beside him. "You are going home now," she whispered. "That is exactly where you belong." As Rowan lifted Lucian into his arms, a soft golden light surrounded father and son before extending gently toward Evelyn. It wrapped around her for only a heartbeat, warm as morning sunlight, before fading into the peaceful evening air. Captain Elias watched with quiet amazement. Ancient blessings rarely revealed themselves, and never without purpose. Rowan stepped closer to Evelyn, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a king making a promise rather than a command. "The gates of my kingdom will always remain open to the woman who protected its greatest treasure." Evelyn looked up in surprise. Rowan continued with quiet sincerity. "You expected nothing in return, yet you reminded me that true leadership begins with kindness. That is a lesson neither crowns nor power can teach." Lucian rested comfortably against his father's shoulder, but stretched one little paw toward Evelyn as though reluctant to leave her behind. She smiled through grateful tears and waved gently. "Be happy, little one." The Alpha King inclined his head with deep respect before turning toward the waiting road. The royal guards followed in silent formation, their banners disappearing slowly into the evening mist. Evelyn remained beside her cottage until the last glimpse of silver vanished beyond the trees. Although the garden had grown quiet once again, it no longer felt lonely. Somewhere beyond the forest, a family had been made whole. Somewhere within her own heart, hope had quietly taken root. And high above Ashen Ridge, beneath a sky filled with countless stars, destiny smiled upon an ordinary Omega whose greatest strength had never been power at all, but the simple courage to answer one small cry that everyone else had chosen to ignore.